Chapter 20. Just as in the churchyard with Miles, the whole thing was upon us. Much as I had made of the fact that his name had never once, between us, been sounded, the quick smitten glare with which the child's face now received it fairly likened my breach of the silence to the smash of a pane of glass. It added the interposing cry, as if to stay the blow, that Mrs. Groves at the same instant uttered over my violence, the shriek of a creature scared, or rather wounded, which in turn, within a few seconds, was completed by a gasp of my own. I seized my colleague's arm. "She's there! She's there!" Miss Jessel stood before us on the opposite bank exactly as she had stood the other time, and I remember strangely, as the first feeling now produced in me, my thrill of joy at having brought on a proof. She was there, and I was justified. She was there, and I was neither cruel nor mad. She was there for poor sacred Mrs. Groves, but she was there most for Flora, and no moment of my monstrous time was perhaps so extraordinary as that in which I consciously threw out to her, with the sense that, pale and ravenous demon as she was, she would catch and understand it, an inarticulate message of gratitude. She rose erect on the spot, my friend, and I had lately quitted, and there was not, in all the long reach of her desire, an inch of her evil that fell short. This first vividness of vision and emotion were things of a few seconds, during which Mrs. Groves's dazed blink across to where I pointed struck me as a sovereign sign that she too at last saw, just as it carried my own eyes precipitately to the child. The revelation, then, of the manner in which Flora was affected startled me, in truth, far more than it would have done to find her also merely agitated, for direct dismay was of course not what I had expected. Prepared and on her guard, as our pursuit had actually made her, she would repress enemy betrayal, and I was therefore shaken on the spot by my first glimpse of the particular one for which I had not allowed. To see her, without a convulsion of her small pink face, not even feign to glance in the direction of the prodigy I announced, but only, instead of that, turn at me an expression of hard, still gravity, an expression absolutely new and unprecedented, and that appeared to read and accuse and judge me. This was a stroke that somehow converted the little girl herself into the very presence that could make me quail. I quailed, even though my certitude that she thoroughly saw was never greater than at that instant, and in the immediate need to defend myself, I called it passionately to witness. "She's there, you little unhappy thing. There, and you see her, as well as you see me," I had said shortly before to Mrs. Groves, that she was not at these times a child, but an old woman, and that description of her could not have been more strikingly confirmed than in the way in which, for all answer to this, she simply showed me, without a concession, an admission of her eyes, a countenance of deeper and deeper, of indeed suddenly quite fixed reprobation. I was by this time, if I can put the whole thing at all together, more appalled at what I may properly call her manner than at anything else, though it was simultaneously with this that I became aware of having Mrs. Groves also, and very formidably, to reckon with. My elder companion, the next moment at any rate, blotted out everything but her own flushed face and her loud, shocked protest, a burst of high disapproval. "What a dreadful turn, to be sure, miss. Where on earth did you see anything?" I could only grasp her more quickly yet, for even while she spoke the hideous plain presence stood, undimmed and undaunted. It had already lasted a minute, and it lasted while I continued, seizing my colleague, quite thrusting her at it and presenting her to it, to insist with my pointing hand. You don't see exactly as we see? You mean to say you don't now? Now? She's as big as a blazing fire. Only look, dearest woman, look! She looked, even as I did, and gave me with her deep groan of negation, repulsion, compassion, the mixture with her pity of her relief at her exemption, a sense, touching to me even then, that she would have backed me up if she could. I might well have needed that, for with this hard blow of the proof that her eyes were hopelessly sealed, I felt my own situation horribly crumbled. I saw, my livid predecessor press from her position on my defeat, and I was conscious, more than all, of what I should have, from this instant, to deal with in the astounding little attitude of Flora. Into this attitude Mrs. Groves immediately and violently entered, breaking even while there pierced through my sense of ruin a prodigious private triumph, into breathless reassurance. She isn't there, little lady, and nobody's there. And you never see nothing, my sweet. How can poor Miss Jessel, when poor Miss Jessel's dead and buried? We know, don't we, love? And she appealed, blundering into the child. It's all a mere mistake, and a worry, and a joke, and we'll go home as fast as we can. Her companion on this had responded with a strange, quick primness of propriety, and they were again, with Mrs. Groves on her feet, united, as it were, in pained opposition to me. Flora continued to fix me with her small mask of reprobation, and even at that minute I prayed God to forgive me for seeming to see that, as she stood there holding tight to our friend's dress, her incompatible childish beauty had suddenly failed, had quite vanished. I've said it already. She was hideously hard. She had turned common and almost ugly. I don't know what you mean. I see nobody. I see nothing. I never have. I think you're cruel. I don't like you. Then after this deliverance, which might have been that of a vulgarly pert little girl in the street, she hugged Mrs. Groves more closely and buried in her skirts the dreadful little face. In this position she produced an almost furious wail. Take me away! Take me away! Oh, take me away from her! From me? I panted. From you! From you! She cried. Even when Mrs. Groves looked across at me dismayed, while I had nothing to do but communicate again with a figure that on the opposite bank, without a movement, as rigidly still as if catching beyond the interval our voices, was as vividly there for my disaster as it was not there for my service. The wretched child had spoken exactly as if she had got from some outside source each of her stabbing little words, and I can therefore, in the full despair of all I had to accept, but sadly shake my head at her. If I had never doubted, all my doubt would at present have gone. I've been living with the miserable truth, and now it has only too much closed around me. Of course I've lost you. I've interfered, and you've seen, under her dictation, with which I faced over the pool again, our infernal witness. The easy and perfect way to meet it. I've done my best, but I've lost you. Goodbye. For Mrs. Groves, I had an imperative, an almost frantic, go, go, before which, in infinite distress, but mutely possessed of the little girl and clearly convinced, in spite of her blindness, that something awful had occurred and some collapse engulfed us, she retreated by the way we had come as fast as she could move. Of What first happened when I was left alone, I had no subsequent memory. I only knew that at the end of, I suppose, a quarter of an hour, an odorous dampness and roughness, chilling and piercing my trouble, had made me understand that I must have thrown myself on my face, on the ground, and given way to the wildness of grief. I must have laid there long and cried and sobbed, for when I raised my head, the day was almost done. I got up and looked a moment through the twilight at the great pool and its black haunted edge, and then I took back to the house my dreary and difficult course. When I reached the gate in the fence, the boat, to my surprise, was gone, so that I had a fresh reflection to make on Flora's extraordinary command of the situation. She passed that night by the most tacit, and I should add, were not the word so grotesque a false note, the happiest of arrangements with Mrs. Groves. I saw neither of them on my return, but on the other hand, as by an ambiguous compensation, I saw a great deal of Miles. I saw, I can use no other phrase, so much of him that it was as if it were more than it had ever been. No evening I had passed at Bly had the pretentious quality of this one, in spite of which, and in spite also of the deeper depths of consternation that had opened beneath my feet, there was literally, in the ebbing actual, an extraordinarily sweet sadness. On reaching the house, I had never so much as looked for the boy. I'd simply gone straight to my room, to change what I was wearing, and to take in, at a glance, much material testimony to Flora's rupture. Her little belongings had all been removed. When later, by the schoolroom fire, I was served with tea by the usual maid, I indulged on the article of my other pupil in no inquiry whatever. He had his freedom now. He might have it to the end. Well, he did have it, and it consisted, in part at least, of his coming in at about 8 o'clock and sitting down with me in silence. On the removal of the tea things, I had blown out the candles and drawn my chair closer. I was conscious of a moral coldness and felt as if I should never again be warm. So when he appeared, I was sitting in the glow with my thoughts. He paused a moment by the door, as if to look at me, then as if to share them, came to the other side of the hearth, and sank into a chair. We sat there in absolute stillness. Yet he wanted, I felt, to be with me. Chapter 21. Before a new day in my room had fully broken, my eyes opened to Mrs. Groves, who had come to my bedside with worse news. Flora was so markedly feverish that an illness was perhaps at hand. She had passed a night of extreme unrest, a night agitated above all by fears that had for their subject not in the least her former, but wholly her present, governess. It was not against the possible re-entrance of Miss Jessel on the scene that she protested. It was conspicuously and passionately against mine. I was promptly on my feet, of course, and with an immense deal to ask, the more that my friend had discernibly now girded her loins to meet me once more. This I felt as soon as I had put to her the question of her sense of the child's sincerity as against my own. She persists in denying to you that she saw or has ever seen anything? My visitor's trouble truly was great. Ah, miss, it isn't a matter on which I can push her, yet it isn't either, I must say, as if I much needed to. It has made her, every inch of her, quite old. Oh, I see her perfectly from here. She resents, for all the world like some little personage, the imputation on her truthfulness and, as it were, her respectability. Miss Jessel, indeed, she. Ah, she's respectable, the chit. The impression she gave me there yesterday was, I assure you, the very strangest of all. It was quite beyond any of the others. I did put my foot in it. She'll never speak to me again. Hideous and obscure as it all was, it held Mrs. Groves briefly silent. Then she granted my point with a frankness which, I made sure, had more behind it. I think, indeed, miss, she never will. She do have a grand manner about it. And that manner, I summed it up, is practically what's the matter with her now. Oh, that manner. I could see in my visitor's face, and not a little besides. She asks me every 3 minutes if I think you're coming in. I see. I, too, on my side, had so much more than worked it out. Has she said to you since yesterday, except to repudiate her familiarity with anything so dreadful, a single word about Miss Jessel? Not one, miss. And of course you know, my friend added, I took it from her by the lake that, just then, and there at least, there was nobody. Rather, and naturally, you take it from her still. I don't contradict her. What else can I do? Nothing in the world. You've the cleverest little person to deal with. They've made them, their two friends. I mean, still cleverer even than nature did, for it was wondrous material to play on. Flora has now her grievance, and she'll work it to the end. Yes, miss, but to what end? Why, that of dealing with me to her uncle. She'll make me out to him the lowest creature. I winced at the fair show of the scene in Mrs. Groves's face. She looked for a minute, as if she sharply saw them together. And him who thinks so well of you? He has an odd way, it comes over me now, I laughed, of proving it. But that doesn't matter. What Flora wants, of course, is to get rid of me. My companion bravely concurred. Never again to so much as look at you. So that what you've come to me now for, I asked, is to speed me on my way? Before she had time to reply, however, I had her in check. I've a better idea, the result of my reflections. My going would seem the right thing, and on Sunday I was terribly near it. Yet that won't do. It's you who must go. You must take Flora. My visitor at this did speculate. But where in the world? Away from here. Away from them. Away even most of all now from me. Straight to her uncle. Only to tell on you? No, not only. To leave me, in addition, with my remedy. She was still vague. And what is your remedy? Your loyalty to begin with. And then Miles's. She looked at me hard. Do you think he won't, if he has the chance, turn on me? Yes, I venture still to think it. At all events, I want to try. Get off with his sister as soon as possible and leave me with him alone. I was amazed myself at the spirit I had still in reserve, and therefore perhaps a trifle the more disconcerted at the way in which, in spite of this fine example of it, she hesitated. There's one thing, of course, I went on. They mustn't, before she goes, see each other for 3 seconds. Then it came over me that, in spite of Flora's presumable sequestration from the instant of her return from the pool, it might already be too late. Do you mean, I anxiously asked, that they have met? At this, she quite flushed. Ah, miss, I'm not such a fool as that. If I've been obliged to leave her 3 or 4 times, it has been each time with one of the maids, and at present, though she's alone, she's locked in safe And yet, there were too many things. And yet what? Well, are you sure of the little gentleman? I'm sure of anything but you. But I have since last evening a new hope. I think he wants to give me an opening. I do believe that, poor little exquisite wretch. He wants to speak. Last evening, in the firelight and the silence, he sat with me for 2 hours, as if it were just coming. Mrs. Groves looked hard through the window at the gray gathering day. And did it come? No, though I waited and waited. I confess it didn't, and it was without a breach of the silence or so much as a faint allusion to his sister's condition and absence that we at last kissed for good night. All the same, I continued, I can't, if her uncle sees her, consent to his seeing her brother without my having given the boy, and most of all because things have got so bad, a little more time. My friend appeared on this ground more reluctant than I could quite understand. What do you mean by more time? Well, a day or two, really to bring it out. He'll then be on my side, of which you see the importance. If nothing comes, I shall only fail, and you will, at the worst, have helped me by doing on your arrival in town whatever you may have found possible. So I put it before her. But she continued for a little, so inscrutably embarrassed that I came again to her aid. Unless, indeed, I wound up, you really want not to go. I could see it in her face. At last, clear itself, she put out her hand to me as a pledge. I'll go this morning. I wanted to be very just. If you should wish still to wait, I would engage she shouldn't see me. No, it's the place itself. She must leave it. She held me a moment with heavy eyes, then brought out the rest. Your idea is the right one. I myself, well, I can't stay. The look she gave me with it made me jump at possibilities. You mean that since yesterday you have seen? She shook her head with dignity. I've heard. Heard? From that child. Horrors. There, she sighed with tragic relief. On my honor, miss, she says things. But at this evocation she broke down. She dropped with a sudden sob upon my sofa and, as I had seen her do before, gave way to all the grief of it. It was quite in another manner that I, for my part, let myself go. Oh, thank God. She sprang up again at this, drying her eyes with a groan. Thank God? It so justifies me. It does, miss? I couldn't have desired more emphasis, but I just hesitated. She's so horrible? I saw my colleague scarce knew how to put it. Really shocking. And about me? About you, miss? Since you must have it, it's beyond everything for a young lady, and I can't think wherever she must have picked up the appalling language she applied to me. I can, then, I broke in with a laugh that was doubtless significant enough. It only in truth left my friend still more grave. Well, perhaps I ought to also, since I've heard some of it before. Yet I can't bear it, the poor woman went on while, with the same movement, she glanced, on my dressing table, at the face of my watch. But I must go back. I kept her, however. Ah, if you can't bear it. How can I stop with her, you mean? Why, just for that, to give her away. Far from this, she pursued, far from them. She may be different, she may be free. I seized her almost with joy. Then, in spite of yesterday, you believe? In such doings, her simple description of them required, in the light of her expression, to be carried no further, and she gave me the whole thing as she had never done. I believe. Yes, it was a joy, and we were still shoulder to shoulder. If I might continue sure of that, I should care but little what else happened. My support in the presence of disaster would be the same as it had been in my early need of confidence, and if my friend would answer for my honesty, I would answer for all the rest. On the point of taking leave of her, nonetheless, I was to some extent embarrassed. There's one thing, of course, it occurs to me to remember. My letter giving the alarm will have reached town before you. I now perceived still more how she had been beating about the bush and how weary at last it had made her. Your letter won't have got there. Your letter never went. What became of it? Goodness knows. Master Miles, do you mean he took it? I gasped. She hung fire, but she overcame her reluctance. I mean that I saw yesterday when I came back with Miss Flora that it wasn't where you had put it. Later in the evening, I had a quick chance to question Luke, and he declared that he had neither noticed nor touched it. We can only exchange on this, one of our deeper mutual soundings, and it was Mrs. Groves who first brought up the plum with an almost elate, "You see?" Yes, I see that if Miles took it instead, he probably will have read it and destroyed it. And do you see anything else? I faced her a moment with a sad smile. It strikes me that by this time your eyes are open even wider than mine. They proved to be so indeed. But she could still blush, almost to show it. I make out now what he must have done at school, and she gave me her simple sharpness, an almost droll, disillusioned nod. He stole. I turned it over. I tried to be more judicial. Well, perhaps. She looked as if she found me unexpectedly calm. He stole letters? She couldn't know my reasons for a calmness after all pretty shallow. So I showed them off as I might. I hope then it was to more purpose than in this case. The note, at any rate, that I put on the table yesterday, I pursued, will have him so scant an advantage, for it contained only the bare demand for an interview, that he is already much ashamed of having gone so far for so little, and that what he had on his mind last evening was precisely the need of confession. I seemed to myself, for the instant, to have mastered it, to see it all. Leave us, leave us. I was already at the door, hurrying her off. I'll get it out of him. He'll meet me. He'll confess. If he confesses, he's saved. And if he's saved, then you are. The dear woman kissed me on this, and I took her farewell. I'll save you without him, she cried as she went. Chapter 22. Yet it was when she had got off, and I missed her on the spot, that the great pinch really came. If I had counted on what it would give me to find myself alone with Miles, I speedily perceived, at least, that it would give me a measure. No hour of my stay, in fact, was so assailed with apprehensions as that of my coming down to learn that the carriage containing Mrs. Groves and my younger pupil had already rolled out of the gates. Now I said to myself, face to face with the elements, and for much of the rest of the day, while I fought my weakness, I could consider that I had been supremely rash. It was a tighter place still than I had yet turned round in. All the more that, for the first time, I could see in the aspect of others a confused reflection of the crisis. What had happened naturally caused them all to stare. There was too little of the explained, throw out whatever we might, in the suddenness of my colleague's act. The maids and the men looked blank. the effect of which on my nerves was an aggravation until I saw the necessity of making it a positive aid. It was precisely, in short, by just clutching the helm that I avoided total wreck, and I dare say that, to bear up all, I became that morning very grand and very dry. I welcomed the consciousness that I was charged with much to do, and I caused it to be known as well that, left thus to myself, I was quite remarkably firm. I wandered with that manner for the next hour or two all over the place and looked, I have no doubt, as if I were ready for any onset. So for the benefit of whom it might concern, I paraded with a sick heart. The person it appeared least to concern proved to be, till dinner, little Miles himself. My perambulations had given me, meanwhile, no glimpse of him, but they had tended to make more public the change taking place in our relation as a consequence of his having at the piano the day before kept me, in Flora's interest, so beguiled and befooled. The stamp of publicity had, of course, been fully given by her confinement and departure, and the change itself was now ushered in by our non-observance of the regular custom of the schoolroom. He had already disappeared when, on my way down, I pushed open his door, and I learned below that he had breakfasted in the presence of a couple of the maids with Mrs. Groves and his sister. He had then gone out, as he said, for a stroll, than which nothing, I reflected, could better have expressed his frank view of the abrupt transformation of my office. What he would now permit this office to consist of was yet to be settled. There was a queer relief, at all events, I mean for myself in especial, in renouncement of one pretension. If so much had sprung to the surface, I scarce put it too strongly in saying that what had perhaps sprung highest was the absurdity of our prolonging the fiction that I had anything more to teach him. It sufficiently stuck out that, by tacit little tricks, in which, even more than myself, he carried out the care for my dignity, I had had to appeal to him to let me off straining to meet him on the ground of his true capacity. He had, at any rate, his freedom now. I was never to touch it again, as I had simply shown, moreover, when, on his joining me in the schoolroom the previous night, I had uttered, on the subject of the interval just concluded, neither challenge nor hint. I had too much from this moment my other ideas. Yet when he at last arrived, the difficulty of applying them, the accumulations of my problems, were brought straight home to me by the beautiful little presents on which what had occurred had as yet, for the eye, dropped neither stain nor shadow. To mark for the house the high state I cultivated, I decreed that my meals with the boy should be served, as we called it, downstairs, so that I had been awaiting him in the ponderous pomp of the room outside of the window, of which I had had from Mrs. Groves that first scared Sunday, my flash of something it would scarce have done to call light. Here, at present, I felt afresh, for I had felt it again and again. How my equilibrium depended on the success of my rigid will, the will to shut my eyes as tight as possible to the truth that what I had to deal with was revoltingly against nature, I can only get on at all by taking, quote, nature, end quote, into my confidence and my account, by treating my monstrous ordeal as a push in a direction unusual, of course, and unpleasant, but demanding, after all, for a fair front, only another turn of the screw of ordinary human virtue. No attempt, nonetheless, could well require more tact than just this attempt to supply oneself all the nature. How could I put even a little of that article into a suppression of reference to what had occurred? How, on the other hand, could I make a reference without a new plunge into the hideous obscure? Well, a sort of answer after a time had come to me, and it was so far confirmed as that I was met incontestably by the quickened vision of what was rare in my little companion. It was indeed as if he had found, even now, as he had so often found at lessons, still some other delicate way to ease me off. Wasn't there a light in the fact which, as we shared our solitude, broke out with a spacious glitter it had never yet quite worn? The fact that, opportunity aiding, precious opportunity which had now come, it would be preposterous with a child so endowed to forego the help one might wrest from absolute intelligence. What had his intelligence been given him for but to save him? Mightn't one, to reach his mind, risk the stretch of an angular arm over his character? It was as if, when we were face to face in the dining room, he had literally shown me the way. The roast mutton was on the table, and I had dispensed with attendance. Miles, before he sat down, stood a moment, with his hands in his pocket, and looked at the joint, on which he seemed on the point of passing some humorous judgment. But what he presently produced was, "I say, my dear, is she really very awfully ill?" "Little Flora? Not so bad, but that she'll presently be better. London will set her up." Bly had ceased to agree with her. "Come here and take your mutton." He alertly obeyed me, carried the plate carefully to his seat, and, when he was established, went on. "Did Bly disagree with her so terribly suddenly?" "Not so suddenly as you might think. One had seen it coming on." "Then why didn't you get her off before?" "Before what?" "Before she became too ill to travel." I found myself prompt. "She's not too ill to travel. She only might have become so if she had stayed. This was just the moment to seize. The journey will dissipate the influence." Oh, I was grand. "And carry it off." I see. Miles, for that matter, was grand too. He settled to his repast with a charming little, quote, table manner, end quote, that, from the day of his arrival, he had relieved me of all grossness of admonition. Whatever he had been driven from school for, it was not for ugly feeding. He was irreproachable as always today, but he was unmistakably more conscious. He was discernibly trying to take for granted more things than he found, without assistance, quite easy. And he dropped into peaceful silence while he felt his situation. Our meal was of the briefest, mine a vain pretense, and I had the things immediately removed. While this was done, Miles stood again, with his hands in his little pockets and his back to me, stood and looked out of the window through which, that other day, I had seen what pulled me up. We continued silent while the maid was with us, as silent, it whimsically occurred to me, as some young couple who, on their wedding journey at the inn, feel shy in the presence of the waiter. He turned round only when the waiter had left us. "Well, so we're alone."